Welcome to the special meeting of Troy City Council, Monday, March 25th, 2024. It is 6 o'clock, and we're in City Council chambers. Mrs. Knight, could you please call the roll?
Mr. Phillips?
Here.
Mrs. Marshall?
Here.
Mr. Sievert? Mr. Schilling?
Present.
Mr. Whidden?
Here.
Mrs. Westfall?
Here.
Mr. Pierce?
Present.
Mr. Twist?
Here.
Mrs. Sneed?
Motion to excuse Mr. Sievert.
Second. Motion to excuse Mr. Sievert by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mr. Mr. Pierce. Mrs. Knight, could you please call the roll?
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mrs. Westfall?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert is excused.
Motion to excuse Mrs. Sneed.
Second. Motion to excuse Mrs. Snee by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mr. Schilling. Mrs. Knight, could you please call the roll on that?
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mrs. Westfall?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mrs. Sneed is excused.
Thank you. So, reading and acknowledgement of notice of special meeting, Troy City Council.
Addressed to the members of City Council, you are hereby notified that there will be a special meeting of the City Council, the City of Troy, Ohio, at the Council Chambers in said city on Monday, the 25th day of March, 2024 at 6 p.m. for the purpose of considering the following legislation: Resolution 12, 2024, accept recommendation of Tax Incentive Review Council regarding enterprise zone agreements; Resolution R13, 2024, accept recommendation of Tax Incentive Review Council regarding Troy Town Park TIF; R14, 2024, authorized bidding and contracting for Broadford Bridge Rehabilitation Project, $260,000; ordinance number 09, 2024, adopted 2024 Emergency Operations Plan; ordinance number 010, 2024, authorized Treasure Island Park use agreements for concert on June 22 and August 3; and 011, 2024, authorized temporary expansion of Dora boundary for Treasure Island concerts June 22, July 4th, August 3, 2024. I will send this around to be signed.
Thank you. And there's no committee reports, so we go to citizens' comments. Is there any, is it a 2-minute limit? Hopefully you've silenced your cell phone, and if you would like to address any item on the agenda tonight, please come forward. Seeing none, we will go proceed to resolutions. Mrs. Knight, could you please read Resolution R12, 2024?
Resolution number R12, 2024, resolution accepting the recommendations of the Tax Incentive Review Council and declaring an emergency. The Tax Incentive Review Council recommended that the enterprise zone agreements be extended. This is the second reading.
Move to suspend.
Second. Motion to suspend the reading by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mr. Twist. Mrs. Knight, could you please call the roll?
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mrs. Westfall?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mrs. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips? Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes. Move to adopt. Second.
Motion to adopt resolution by Mr. Twist, seconded by Mr. Phillips. Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mrs. Westfall?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Mrs. Knight, could you read Resolution R13, 2024, please?
Resolution number R13, 2024, resolution accepting the recommendation of the Tax Incentive Review Council for the Troy Town Park TIF and declaring an emergency. The recommendation was that the TIF be continued. This is the second reading.
Move to suspend. Second.
Motion to suspend the reading is by Mr. Pierce, seconded by Mr. Twist. Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mrs. Westfall?
Yes.
Move to adopt.
Second. Motion to adopt the resolution by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mr. Twist. Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mrs. Westfall?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Could you please read Resolution R-14, 2024?
Resolution number R-14, 2024. Resolution authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety to advertise for bids and enter into a contract for the Broadford Road Bridge, State Route 41 East Rehabilitation Project. Cost not to exceed $260,000. Second reading.
Motion to suspend the rules. Second.
Motion to suspend by Mr. Whidden, seconded by Mr. Pierce. Mrs. Knight, could you please call the roll?
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mrs. Westfall?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes. Move to adopt. Second.
Motion to to adopt by Mr. Twist, seconded by Mr. Whidden. Mrs. Knight, would you please call the roll?
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mrs. Westfall?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes. Resolution
Resolution is adopted.
Moving on to ordinances. Mrs. Knight, could you please read Ordinance 09, 2024?
Ordinance number 09, 2024, ordinance adopting the City of Troy, Ohio Emergency Operations Plan and declaring an emergency. This will adopt the 2024 edition of the plan. Second reading.
Move to suspend. Second.
Motion to suspend the readings by Mr. Schilling, seconded by Mr. Twist. Mrs. Knight, could you please call the roll?
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mrs. Westfall?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Move to adopt. Second.
Motion to adopt by Mr. Twist, seconded by Mr. Pierce. Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mrs. Westfall?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Mrs. Knight, could you please read Ordinance 010, 2024?
Ordinance number 010, 2024. Ordinance authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety of the City of Troy, Ohio to execute a Treasure Island non-ticketed use agreement for 2024 events at Treasure Island Park. This is for the concerts on June 22 and August 3, recommended by the Recreation Board and Board of Park Commissioners. Second reading.
Motion to suspend.
Second.
Motion to suspend the reading is by Mr. Whidden, seconded by Mrs. Westfall. Mrs. Knight, could you please call the roll?
Mrs. Westfall?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes. Motion to approve.
Second.
Motion to adopt by Mr. Whidden, seconded by Mrs. Westfall. Mrs. Knight, could you please call the roll?
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mrs. Westfall?
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Mrs. Knight, could you read our last ordinance of the evening, 011, 2024?
Ordinance number 011, 2024, ordinance permitting use of certain real property in the designated outdoor refreshment area for use as a designated outdoor refreshment area for events on June 24, July 4th, and August 3, 2024. These have also been recommended by the Board of Park Commissioners and the Recreation Board. Second reading.
Move to suspend. Second.
Motion to suspend the readings is by Mr. Phelps, seconded by Mr. Schilling. Mrs. Knight, could you please call the roll?
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mrs. Westfall?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes. Move to adopt. Second.
Motion to adopt by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mr. Schilling. Mrs. Knight, could you please call the roll?
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mrs. Westfall?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
No.
Ordinance is adopted.
Okay. All right. So, we can do no other business as special meeting, correct? Okay. Monday, yeah. So that means we are adjourning, and our next meeting is April 1st, at 7 p.m., council chambers. Thank you for attending.